Ready to go?
Yep.
Let's do this. All right.
Right, so we've had quite a bit of action with security happening in the news lately. Facebook, the Apache Struts incident with Equifax. So there's a lot of talk about data and data security. And
well, this was certainly a breach of trust.
Ed, can you brief us on what happened with Facebook specifically?
So yeah, Facebook, it's an open platform. Everyone uses it, it's free, they think it's safe. But basically Cambridge Analytica and other companies have harvested data off of it without people's knowledge. Even Facebook itself didn't know. Then they did know, and they didn't disclose it to people, which is even worse, right?
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting, because a researcher by the name of Alexander Kagan writes a custom application for the Facebook store. Part of the agreement as you use this application is that your personal data will be given to the writers of the app for a reason. When this application is launched, however, Facebook's APIs are not very secure.
So if you joined the app, I would not just see your Facebook profile, I would see all of the Facebook profiles of everybody that you're friends with.
But this is where it gets pretty bad. Cambridge Analytica purchases the data gathered from this scientist.
They just come to you and say, oh, we'd like to buy your data, and you're like, yeah, sure, no problem.
No, so they initially approached me to do some consulting work for them, mostly on surveys. And then this project was born to collect new data.
Now, by the time he siphons all of the data, it's not just the 250,000 users that subscribed to use the application and gave their permission, but it's all of their friends, and roughly ends up with 80 million users. Now you may think, okay, so what's the big deal? Cambridge Analytica is just a predictive analytics company that does research. And it's not like they're corrupt or do meddling in
and language and imagery that they're likely to engage with. And we use that in America, and we use that in Africa. That's what we do.
Okay, so to wrap this up, the biggest issue with this scandal is that it's not really about the data that was pulled. It's about the design patterns and the lack of attention and how APIs are being built and designed at Facebook that is causing the biggest uproar. So it really brings us back to how do you think about your software development and what role does security and privacy play in that game?
How do you think the regulatory body is addressing this, or what's coming out in terms of regulatory?
So I think, from an EU perspective in Europe, there's a lot more around privacy and intellectual property law and things like that. Things around GDPR, which is basically a law around people's privacy.
GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation. Even though this regulation is originating in Europe, it's actually going to affect all the organizations that do business outside of the US with potential European customers. For example, if it's an airline that's selling tickets to a European citizen, the airline needs to adopt. Additionally, a violation of GDPR regulation may result in fines of up to $80 million or 4% of annual total revenue. So this is a significant stick that the EU is planning to use. The enforcement of the rule set is taking effect on May 25th. The regulation has two fundamental principles that companies need to be aware of. One, it's the right of portability. So if a customer wants to switch pension plans, for example, they should be able to get their data and move to a different pension provider. The second one is the right to erasure, which means that the customer may request to be forgotten from your systems, essentially disconnecting the link between the data that you have about them or their transactions and their identity. And lastly, there's a clause in GDPR that requires you to notify the customer within 72 hours of a breach.
Yeah, like you're totally correct. I mean, the EU again has their new standard of open banking, and they've actually had it since 2012. And they've come out with a new directive, the PDS2, which basically is an open banking law. And inside that law is about security and making sure that your open APIs, those RESTful APIs that you're going to allow other payment vendors to work with banking, they're not traditional bankers that may not be adhering to all the banking regulations.
PSD2 stands for Second Payment Services Directive. Really what it means is that banks need to open up their data and allow customers to use third-party services that are able to build applications on top of that transactional data. A good example would be Mint.com. They do aggregation of all of your different accounts and as a result advise the customer of how to spend or save their money. And while GDPR is a restrictive policy that really strives to protect customers' data, PSD2 is actually a move in the opposite direction. Areas to consider, security being the obvious one, is your infrastructure and services structured in a way that is infinitely scalable. PSD2 assumes that third-party applications could pull data from your infrastructure. And lastly, how does this influence your core? Is your core banking platform and microservices fundamentally designed in a way that can support this type of integration.
The way that companies need to do that is basically make security a first, right? And when we say security as a first, it's a principle from engineering and design. And making sure that basically they implement certain things like security training for their developers, for doing static coding scans using tools like Fortify, like SonarCube, and those kind of tools which go through the code, scan it, and ensure that there are no obvious holes, no security breaches, no leaks. Each sprint requires a peer code review. You should also have some kind of security advisor on the team that will do a security check of the code. And we actually incorporate those static scanning tools into the build process. So part of your DevOps process is to make sure that your code passes not only code coverage, but code security, making sure you're not doing SQL injections or all these obvious things that people have learned over the years. So that just becomes integrated to the process. And if you don't pass those tests, then your code doesn't make it in.
One is, it's important as you think about the future of financial services and open banking and how that is going to affect the way you allow your customers' data to be accessed. Another aspect is our GDPR, as we talked, because that will influence the way that customers behave as far as their data is concerned within the bank. So they essentially own their records, their transactions, or at least their anonymity in relation to those transactions. And that is very likely in terms of US regulations. It's very likely that that's going to come to the US in terms of the ability for a customer to detach themselves from the identification within the bank system, if they choose to do so, if they choose to, for example, switch banks. And check out those 2 articles that we have in there. There are about SDLC as well as some of the other security best practices that we've been talking about lately. So, thanks.